September 25, 1978. A clear blue sky stretches over the city of San Diego. It's a perfect Southern California morning. Calm winds, warm sunlight, and almost no clouds. High above, two aircraft cut across the sky. One is a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727, Flight 182, descending from Los Angeles with 135 people on board. The other, smaller, is a Cessna 172, a training flight with two men inside just finishing a lesson under visual flight rules. It should have been just another ordinary day in American airspace. But within the next few minutes, these two planes will collide, and no one will stop it. At 8:59 a.m., PSA Flight 182 is cleared for approach into San Diego's Lindbergh Field. The crew, Captain James McFerrin, First Officer Robert Fox, and Flight Engineer Martin Wan, begin their descent. Their Boeing 727 slices through the bright morning light at 250 knots, descending through 11,000 feet. Nearby, radar controllers at San Diego TRACON are tracking several aircraft. One of them is a Cessna 172, tail number N7711G, being flown by instructor Martin Kazai and student David Boswell. They're flying a simple instrument training route, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. As Flight 182 nears the city, the controller warns, traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile, northbound. The PSA crew spots the small Cessna below. Got him, one of the pilots says casually. Seconds later, the captain adds, he's passing right underneath us. From the cockpit, it looks as though the smaller plane has already passed clear. But it hasn't. As the Boeing continues to descend, the Cessna disappears below its nose, into the blind spot that every large aircraft has when overtaking smaller planes. From this moment on, the PSA crew believes they're in the clear. But radar shows otherwise. Both planes are now on a collision course. Controllers see the blips converging. No one says a word. No further warnings. At 9 hours 1 minute and 47 seconds, the calm morning turns into catastrophe. Witnesses on the ground see a silver jet diving through sunlight and a small flash of white beneath it. In an instant, the Boeing 727 shears through the Cessna midair. Both aircraft explode, raining debris over the quiet North Park neighborhood below. Fire and metal crash into homes, cars, and streets, leaving a scene of destruction that firefighters would later describe as indescribable. It remains one of the deadliest midair collisions in U.S. history, and one that could have been prevented in seconds. This is the story of PSA Flight 182, the crash that shocked the nation, silenced a city, and forever changed the way America controls its skies. It was a warm Monday morning in Los Angeles. At 8 a.m., the terminals at LAX were already alive with the routine noise of a new workday. PA announcements, rolling suitcases, the smell of jet fuel. Among the dozens of departures lining up that morning was Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182, a short 25-minute hop south to San Diego. For the crew of the Boeing 727-214, it was an ordinary assignment. Captain James McFerrin, 42, had more than 17 years of flying experience and over 10,000 hours on type. Beside him sat First Officer Robert Fox, 35, calm and methodical, and Flight Engineer Martin Wan, 44, whose clipboard never left his hand. Behind them, for flight attendants prepared the cabin for 128 passengers, business travelers, commuters, families returning home. At 8:16 a.m., PSA 182 pushed back from Gate 36 at LAX. The engines, 3 JT-8DS mounted at the tail, spooled to life with their familiar metallic whine. The orange-striped aircraft, with its smiling PSA grin painted on the nose, began taxiing toward runway 24 left. Inside the cockpit, the crew ran through their checklists with practiced rhythm. Set flaps 5. Trim 4 units. Cabin pressure set. Everything was normal. The captain called for takeoff clearance, advanced the throttles, and within seconds the 727 thundered down the runway and lifted gracefully into the morning haze. Below them, Los Angeles shrank into a patchwork of highways and rooftops. The flight climbed on a southeasterly heading toward the coastal corridor linking LA and San Diego, a corridor crowded with air traffic from small private planes, training flights, and airliners all sharing the same clear California sky. By 8:30, Flight 182 was cruising at 11,000 feet, level and smooth. The crew chatted casually with the cabin attendants. Passengers unfolded newspapers or ordered coffee. Nothing hinted that this would be anything but a quick, uneventful flight. Meanwhile, about 30 miles north of San Diego, a Cessna 172 Skyhawk was climbing out of Montgomery Field. It was flown by instructor Martin Kaze, 32, and student pilot David Boswell, 35. They were practicing instrument approaches, basic training under the watch of air traffic control. Their small white aircraft was fitted with a transponder and a temporary radar beacon, making it visible on controller screens. San Diego's skies that morning were exceptionally clear. Visibility 10 miles, no clouds, unlimited ceiling. Under those perfect conditions, the Cessna's training would take place under VFR, visual flight rules, meaning the pilots were responsible for seeing and avoiding other aircraft. In the same airspace, PSA 182 would soon be descending on its arrival path to Lindbergh Field. At 8:50, the 727 checked in with San Diego approach. San Diego approach, PSA 182 with you at 11,000. The controller acknowledged and gave the crew a vector for the standard approach. Maintain 7,000. Turn left heading 180 to intercept Lindbergh. As the big jet began its descent, its radar return placed it roughly 6 miles behind the slower Cessna, both now converging toward the same patch of sky. The controller watched both blips move on his screen, nothing alarming yet, but the difference in speed was dramatic. The Cessna at 120 knots, the Boeing more than 250. In the cockpit, the crew of PSA 182 could already see San Diego ahead, sunlight reflecting off Mission Bay. The captain commented on how clear the day was. The first officer, scanning for traffic, spotted a tiny glint below. Traffic in sight, he reported. The controller confirmed, maintain visual separation. That short phrase transferred responsibility to the pilots, the essence of VFR coordination. From that point on, separation was in their hands. The Cessna crew, unaware they were being followed by a descending airliner, continued their training routine, talking calmly about headings and radio frequencies. No one in either cockpit sensed the chain tightening. At 8:58 a.m., the Boeing leveled at 7,000 feet, beginning its gradual descent toward the city. Inside the cabin, passengers leaned to the windows to glimpse the Pacific Ocean. Flight attendants collected cups and prepared for landing. It was all normal, until the captain received one more transmission from approach control. PSA 182, traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile, northbound. The first officer looked down and slightly right. We've got him. He's passing underneath, another voice added. From their vantage point, the small Cessna appeared to move aft and vanish beneath the nose of the jet, apparently clear. But the radar scope at TRACON told a different story. Both targets now overlapped. As the Boeing turned gently right toward the final approach corridor, neither crew realized they were moments from intersecting paths. The morning sun glittered off two aircraft separated by barely a few hundred feet, closing fast. At 8:59 a.m., San Diego shimmered beneath the morning sun. The Pacific sparkled to the west, downtown stood clear and bright, and hundreds of people were beginning an ordinary workday. Up above, the city's traffic pattern was busier than usual. A dozen light aircraft training, several commercial arrivals inbound from Los Angeles and Phoenix, all converging toward Lindbergh Field, a single runway airport tucked into the heart of the city. For the air traffic controllers inside San Diego approach, the radar screen looked like a shifting constellation of green dots. Each represented a flight, slow, fast, climbing, descending, all of them relying on the calm voices in this small control room. Among those blips were two that would soon meet: PSA Flight 182, descending through 6,000 feet, and Cessna N7711G, holding near 3,500 feet on a training leg north of the field. At 8:59 and 50 seconds, the controller called, PSA 182, traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile. The first officer replied almost instantly, We've got that traffic in sight. Maintain visual separation, the controller said, the standard phrase that transferred collision avoidance to the PSA crew. The captain acknowledged. Inside the cockpit, everyone relaxed a little. They believed the Cessna was below and moving away. What they didn't realize was that the smaller plane had turned right, directly beneath their descent path. From the 727's high cockpit, its nose angle and large engines created a wide blind zone straight ahead. The Cessna had slipped into it perfectly. As Flight 182 continued descending toward 5,000 feet, the captain looked out the left window, scanning the horizon. He could no longer see the smaller aircraft. "Do you still have that traffic?" he asked. The first officer replied, "Yeah, I think he's passed beneath us." Flight Engineer 1 added, "I hope." The cockpit laughed lightly, a moment of casual humor masking the uncertainty. Seconds later, the captain radios approach. "We had the traffic, we're looking." "Roger." The controller answers, believing the situation resolved. No one notices that radar still shows the two returns merging. At 9:30, the Boeing begins its right turn toward runway 27. Outside, the city fills the windows, neat rows of houses, cars glinting on highways, the blue curve of Mission Bay. Inside the cabin, passengers lean over to admire the view. Some point toward the ocean. Others snap photographs of downtown San Diego. Feels like the start of descent, routine, safe, ordinary. Below them, instructor Martin Kaze and student David Boswell in the Cessna are finishing a simulated instrument approach. Kaze, acting as air traffic control for practice, instructs his student. "Turn left heading 070. Climb and maintain 3,500. Boswell reads it back and banks gently. Neither realizes that a descending airliner is now directly above and slightly behind them. From the ground, several witnesses later describe seeing the small white Cessna appear beneath a silver jetliner, sunlight glinting off both. They seem to converge lazily, like two cars approaching an intersection. Then, without warning, the gap vanishes. At 9:01 a.m., the Boeing's cockpit voice recorder captures a faint call-out. "There's one underneath." A heartbeat later, "I think he's passing off to our right." But the Cessna isn't passing off anywhere. It's climbing directly into the 727's right wing. 9:01:47. A sudden jolt tears through the PSA jet. A blinding flash. Metal screams against metal as the Cessna's propeller and landing gear rip through the 727's fuel tanks, instantly igniting a fireball. The Boeing's right wing disintegrates. In the same instant, the Cessna shatters into fragments, vanishing in the explosion. The cockpit recorder fills with chaos. Alarms, shouts, the sound of airflow roaring through a torn fuselage. "We're going down! We're going down!" Someone yells. "This is it!" Another voice cries out. The final words from Flight 182. From below, people on the ground see a terrible sight. A flaming jetliner, nose dipping, trailing smoke and debris as it falls from 2,500 feet. Pieces of wing and fuselage rain down across the quiet North Park neighborhood. A city commuter named Ruth McIntyre, waiting at a bus stop, later said, "It looked like the sky opened and fire fell out." Seconds later, the 727 strikes the ground in a massive explosion. A ball of orange fire engulfing several houses and cars. The shockwave shatters windows for blocks. Flames and smoke rise hundreds of feet into the air. Within moments, police, firefighters, and residents rush toward the inferno. But there is nothing to rescue. All 135 people aboard PSA Flight 182 and both aboard the Cessna are killed instantly. On the ground, 7 residents also lose their lives. The time is 9:02 a.m. From first visual contact to destruction, the entire sequence lasted barely 90 seconds. What went wrong was not visibility, nor weather, nor technology, but a breakdown of awareness, communication, and assumption. And over the coming weeks, investigators will try to answer a haunting question. How could two aircraft, in clear blue skies, see each other and still collide? At 9:02 a.m., the city of San Diego shook. A thunderous explosion tore through the quiet suburb of North Park, just 3 miles north of Lindbergh Field. The shockwave rattled windows across the city, triggering alarms and sending a column of black smoke curling into the flawless blue sky. For the residents of Dwight and Nile Streets, it began with a sound like tearing metal, followed by a burst of light. Then silence for a fraction of a second. And suddenly, fire. Witnesses described seeing the PSA Boeing 727 plunge almost vertically, its right wing engulfed in flame. Trailing smoke and burning debris, it descended in a slow, spiraling fall before vanishing behind rows of houses. And then the ground shook. The aircraft slammed into the intersection of Dwight and Nile Streets at more than 250 miles per hour. The impact obliterated everything within a 600-foot radius. Entire homes vanished in an instant. Cars on the street caught fire where they stood. Trees snapped like matchsticks. The explosion's heat was so intense that asphalt blistered, and wooden fences turned to ash within seconds. A local resident later told reporters, "It was like the world ended right there. The sky fell down on us." Firefighters from Station 14, just blocks away, were among the first to respond. They arrived within minutes, but the scene before them defied comprehension. Flames towered above the neighborhood, fueled by 16,000 gallons of jet fuel. The air shimmered with heat. Debris rained down for blocks. There was no intact aircraft, only fragments of metal, luggage, and unrecognizable wreckage scattered through the burning streets. Paramedics searched desperately for survivors. They found none. The force of the impact had vaporized the fuselage and killed everyone on board instantly. The fire burned for more than an hour before crews could bring it under control. When it finally subsided, the devastation revealed itself in full. 22 homes destroyed, dozens more damaged, and entire families displaced. Smoke drifted across the city, visible from miles away, as emergency vehicles continued to pour into North Park. At San Diego's Lindbergh Field, air traffic controllers who had been watching the radar moments earlier sat in stunned silence. They had seen the two radar targets merge, then disappear. Now, the phone lines to local police and fire departments lit up. The tower supervisor could only say, "We've lost PSA 182. Down in the terminal, families waiting for their loved ones saw the news break live on local radio. Reports described a jetliner down in a residential area. At first, no one could believe it. Not on a clear day like this, not in their city. But soon, black smoke rising on the horizon confirmed the unthinkable. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, were dispatched immediately from Los Angeles. By the afternoon, the crash site was secured, a field of twisted wreckage embedded in city streets. Pieces of the Cessna were found scattered blocks away, fragments of its wings tangled with metal from the Boeing. Journalists and photographers filled the area. The air smelled of fuel and burnt wood. Firefighters worked quietly, covering remains with tarps. In one surreal image captured by a local photographer, the smiling PSA logo on the aircraft's nose section lay half buried in the street. The smile scorched and torn. It became the photograph that defined the disaster. The scale of loss stunned the nation. 144 people in total were dead, 135 aboard PSA Flight 182, 2 aboard the Cessna, and 7 residents on the ground. It was, at that time, the deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history. President Jimmy Carter expressed condolences from Washington, calling it a national tragedy. Flags in California flew at half-mast. San Diego, normally a city of beaches and sunshine, fell silent. At night, candles burned in windows across North Park. Local churches opened their doors for vigils. Volunteers cooked meals for displaced families, while others sifted through rubble looking for what little could be saved. A family photo, a wedding ring, a single shoe that somehow survived. For days, the air hung thick with the smell of burnt fuel and metal. Reporters described the scene as an open wound in the middle of the city. In the days that followed, the question on everyone's mind was the same. How could 2 aircraft, flying in clear weather, both visible to radar and each other, collide over a populated city? Who was responsible, the pilots, the controllers, or the system itself? Those answers would come slowly, piece by piece, as investigators reconstructed the final moments of Flight 182. From the radar tapes, cockpit voice recordings, and haunting eyewitness memories of that bright September morning. By the afternoon of September 25, 1978, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board had already arrived in San Diego. They were greeted not by an airport hangar or wreckage field, but by a neighborhood that no longer existed. The streets of North Park were sealed off by yellow tape and National Guard vehicles. Fire crews continued to hose down smoldering debris while detectives, coroners, and NTSB engineers stepped carefully through the ruins. The air was thick with heat, smoke, and the unmistakable odor of jet fuel. It was here, between the shattered houses of Dwight and Nile streets, that the story of PSA Flight 182 would have to be rebuilt, piece by piece, from ashes and data. The first task was identification. Investigators located the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, buried beneath twisted metal, its bright orange casing scorched but intact. A few blocks away, they recovered the flight data recorder, FDR, which had detached during impact. Both devices were sent to Washington, D.C. for analysis. At the crash site, specialists began mapping wreckage locations, marking each fragment's position with small numbered flags. Engineers studied the breakup pattern, the right wing separation, the path of debris, the scorched impact zone, confirming what radar had already shown. The 727 had been torn apart midair before crashing almost vertically. Several miles to the north, investigators found pieces of the Cessna 172 scattered in an open field. There was no doubt now that a midair collision had occurred. The only question was why. Days later, the cockpit recording was transcribed. The voices of Captain McFerrin, First Officer Fox, and Flight Engineer Wan painted a chilling timeline. The crew had clearly seen the Cessna at one point and reported it to air traffic control. But what followed was a breakdown in shared awareness, a moment when each side believed the other had the situation under control. On the tape, the exchange is calm, even routine. 8 hours, 59 minutes, and 30 seconds. Controller. PSA 182. Traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile. First Officer. Traffic in sight. Controller. Maintain visual separation. From that moment, controllers assumed the Boeing would keep clear. The PSA crew, in turn, assumed the Cessna had already passed safely beneath them. Neither assumption was true. As the Boeing began its right turn toward Lindbergh Field, the smaller aircraft vanished into the jet's blind spot. The cockpit voice recorder captures the creeping uncertainty. Captain, do you still have that traffic? First Officer, yeah, I think he's passed beneath us. Flight Engineer, I hope. Laughter. The laughter is brief, nervous, and final. Within 40 seconds, the tape ends in chaos. Meanwhile, in the San Diego radar room, investigators replayed the controller's scope recording. It showed both aircraft converging on the same altitude. When their radar blips merged, the controller did not issue an emergency call, believing the 727 had already passed. By the time the blips separated again, one had vanished. The NTSB's reconstruction used synchronized radar data, cockpit audio, and ground witness testimony to chart the fatal geometry. The Cessna was climbing at roughly 3,500 feet. The Boeing was descending through 2,600 feet on a shallow right turn. Their closing speed exceeded 300 knots. At 9 hours 1 minute and 47 seconds, the Cessna's propeller and nose wheel struck the underside of the 727's right wing, rupturing a fuel tank and igniting a fireball. Investigators identified transfer streaks of red and white paint along the Boeing's wing structure, physical proof of the collision. Fragments of the Cessna's landing gear were found embedded in the 727's fuel tank assembly. The NTSB's findings would eventually focus on 3 critical failures. Visual separation. The PSA crew lost sight of the Cessna but continued to assume clearance. Air traffic coordination. The controller, believing the crew still had the smaller plane in view, issued no further advisories. Procedural conflict. The overlapping of controlled and training airspace above San Diego created an environment where high-speed jets and slow trainers shared the same altitude corridor, a hazard that had been criticized for years. The board also noted a subtle psychological factor: complacency. Both the airline crew and the controllers were highly experienced. The weather was perfect, the air clear, and the route routine. It was, in every sense, a normal day. That normality bred a false confidence, one that allowed a small uncertainty to grow unnoticed until it became fatal. When the final report was released months later, it concluded that the probable cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew of PSA Flight 182 to establish and maintain adequate visual separation, compounded by the controller's failure to ensure proper radar separation. It also criticized the FAA's handling of congested Southern California airspace, where airline traffic and training flights routinely intersected. It was, in short, a tragedy of assumptions. Everyone had seen it coming, and yet no one had acted in time. In San Diego, the wreckage was cleared piece by piece, the streets repaved, and homes rebuilt. But for the investigators who listened to those final seconds of cockpit audio, the haunting truth remained. 2 aircraft met in a clear blue sky, not because anyone failed to see, but because everyone thought someone else was watching. The investigation's conclusions did little to quiet the storm that followed. When the final report was released, the words felt cold, clinical: failure to maintain visual separation. But in San Diego, for the families who had watched fire fall from the sky, it wasn't a line of text. It was a wound that still burned. Within days of the crash, anger and grief filled the airwaves. Newspapers ran headlines demanding answers. Who let them collide? Radar saw it, why didn't they? At City Hall, residents packed emergency meetings, asking how such a thing could happen in perfect weather, over their own homes. To the public, it seemed unthinkable that a modern airliner, in contact with air traffic control, could simply fly into another aircraft, unseen, unavoided, unstoppable. And yet, that's exactly what had happened. The Civil Aeronautics Board held public hearings in San Diego's Civic Center. For the first time, the cockpit voice recordings were played aloud to a silent audience of families, journalists, and local officials. The room listened as the voices of Captain McFerrin and his crew echoed through the hall, professional, calm, and unaware of the fate minutes ahead. When the tape reached the final moments, "We're going down. This is it." The room fell completely still. Some relatives wept quietly. Others walked out. It was too much to bear. The hearings became a search for blame. Was it the crew of PSA Flight 182 for losing visual contact and assuming clearance? Was it air traffic control for failing to issue a collision warning when radar clearly showed the 2 aircraft converging? Or was it the system itself, a structure that allowed slow-moving training aircraft to share the same sky with descending jetliners over a major city? Each side defended its own. PSA officials argued that the pilots followed procedures as defined by the controller's instructions, that once told to maintain visual separation, they were responsible for the smaller plane's position but had no way of knowing it had re-entered their path. Controllers, meanwhile, countered that they had issued the warning and that the PSA crew explicitly acknowledged seeing the Cessna, an acknowledgement that legally shifted responsibility. In the middle of it all stood the families, who only wanted to know why no one had done more. The NTSB's report, though technical, made one thing clear. This was not the failure of a single individual, it was the failure of human communication within a complex system. Each person involved acted according to procedure, but the procedures themselves were flawed. For example, the San Diego airspace at the time had overlapping zones of responsibility. Commercial flights descending toward Lindbergh Field passed directly through the practice areas used by student pilots from Montgomery Field. Controllers in separate facilities handled them, one overseeing approach traffic, the other managing general aviation, and there was no automatic radar conflict alert system linking the 2 sectors. In essence, PSA Flight 182 and the Cessna 172 were being tracked by 2 different controllers, each assuming the other's aircraft was safely separated. It was a perfect trap, invisible, procedural, and waiting for one misunderstanding to spring it shut. Public outrage pushed the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, to act. Within months, new policies were drafted to separate high-speed commercial routes from training areas. Controllers were issued better radar conflict alerts, an early version of the modern warning systems that now flash on screens whenever two aircraft draw dangerously close. The accident also reignited debate about pilot training culture. Experts noted that PSA, known for its casual, friendly atmosphere, fostered a relaxed cockpit environment where humor was common even during high workload. While not unprofessional, that culture sometimes blurred the line between attentiveness and assumption. On the cockpit tape, the small jokes, the quick laughter had haunted investigators. It wasn't negligence, it was humanity, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. By early 1979, lawsuits were filed by victims' families against PSA, the FAA, and the U.S. government, claiming negligence and procedural failure. Settlements would take years, and none would bring comfort. For many, justice was less about compensation and more about prevention, ensuring no one else would ever see what they had seen that morning. A local resident named John Griffith, who had watched the jet fall from his porch, later said in an interview, "We all saw it. The whole sky was clear, and nobody said anything. That's what I'll never forget." In the end, the blame was shared, a rare admission in aviation history. Every part of the system had worked exactly as designed, and yet the design itself had failed. It was a tragedy without villains, only lessons. Lessons written in radar echoes, cockpit voices, and the silence that followed when two planes met in a perfect sky. The crash of PSA Flight 182 left a scar not only on San Diego, but on American aviation itself. For decades, pilots and controllers had trusted the same system: clear weather, visual contact, and professional judgment to keep aircraft safely apart. On that clear September morning, all three failed at once. In the weeks after the disaster, every cockpit and control room across the country asked the same question: could it happen again? At the Federal Aviation Administration, the shock was immediate. For years, officials had been warned that Southern California skies were dangerously congested. Lindbergh Field sat barely 10 miles from Montgomery Field, a hub for flight schools and small trainers. Both used overlapping airspace, one for jet arrivals, the other for lessons. It worked on paper. In practice, it depended on flawless communication. After the accident, the FAA ordered an emergency review of Southern California airspace design. Controllers described it as a maze in the sky. Commercial airliners were descending through altitudes where Cessnas practiced climbs, often within a few miles of each other. Even a single lapse in radio awareness could bring them together. Within months, boundaries were redrawn. Training routes were shifted eastward. Arrival corridors for Lindbergh Field were narrowed and strictly monitored. And for the first time, separate radar sectors were linked by a shared conflict alert system, a primitive computer that flashed a warning if two aircraft's flight paths intersected. It was crude by modern standards, but it was the beginning of an era where machines would watch the skies alongside humans. In the cockpit, technology also began to change. The PSA 182 report became one of the case studies that led to the development of TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Each aircraft would carry a transponder that constantly broadcast its position. If two planes came too close, both would receive an automatic spoken command: climb, climb now, or descend, descend now. Unlike visual separation, TCAS required no controller intervention, no guesswork, and no trust in weather or eyesight. By the early 1990s, every commercial jet in the United States carried it. The system has since prevented countless near collisions worldwide. Controllers also received new tools. Radar displays were upgraded to show altitude tags and predictive paths, allowing them to see not just where an aircraft was, but where it would be in 30 seconds. Training programs began emphasizing assertive communication: no assumption, no hesitation. If a pilot lost sight of traffic, they were to say it immediately. If a controller saw two aircraft converging, they were to issue an alert without waiting for confirmation. The quiet phrase that sealed Flight 182's fate, "maintain visual separation," was re-examined across the industry. It had always been routine, Now, it was recognized as potentially fatal when issued in mixed airspace. The tragedy also reshaped pilot culture. Recordings from Flight 182 revealed small moments of casual humor in the cockpit, the kind typical of PSA's famously friendly atmosphere. In response, airlines began reinforcing the principle of crew resource management, CRM, a communication discipline where every crew member, regardless of rank, speaks up the moment doubt arises. No assumptions, no silence. That mindset soon spread worldwide. Today, when modern flight crews brief an approach, they quote a principle written in the aftermath of Flight 182. If you lose sight, you call it. If you're unsure, you question it. If it doesn't look right, you break off. Those simple habits, learned through tragedy, now protect millions of passengers every day. By the early 1980s, San Diego's airspace was completely redesigned. The FAA separated Montgomery Field's practice zones from Lindbergh Field arrivals. A new radar facility, the Southern California TRACON, unified controllers from multiple airports into one coordinated center. For the first time, a single radar room could watch every aircraft from Los Angeles to the Mexican border. It was one of the most comprehensive air traffic reforms in U.S. history, and its blueprint would later influence systems in Europe, Asia, and South America. Today, more than 4 decades later, every flight that crosses American skies still carries a quiet legacy from that morning. Every traffic alert from a TAS unit, every radar conflict warning, every procedural reminder in controller training, all trace their origins back to PSA 182. Out of 144 lives lost came thousands saved. Progress born from silence. Safety built from ashes. In the years after the tragedy, the skies above San Diego healed faster than the people beneath them. The streets of North Park were rebuilt. New houses, new trees, fresh asphalt where once the wreckage had burned. But for those who lived through that morning, the sound of jet engines would never mean the same thing again. Every September, residents still gather quietly at the corner of Dwight and Nile Streets, where Flight 182 struck the ground at 9:02 a.m. There is no large monument, no marble memorial, only a small plaque beneath a tree, engraved with 144 names. It reads, "In memory of those who perished, September 25, 1978. May we never forget." Visitors bring flowers. Some bring photos. Former PSA employees sometimes stand in silence, their uniforms long retired, their memories still sharp. The neighborhood around them hums with the life of a new generation that knows the story only as a piece of local history. But for aviation, the legacy of Flight 182 is anything but local. In flight schools across the world, new pilots still study the final moments of that day. They watch the radar replays, read the transcripts, and listen to the cockpit tape, not to relive tragedy, but to understand how fast normal can turn into disaster. In every training simulator, the lesson of maintain visual separation is now taught with caution. See, verify, confirm, never assume. If you lose sight, say so. If you're not sure, speak up. Silence kills. The crash became one of the cornerstone case studies for crew resource management, CRM, the communication philosophy that revolutionized cockpit teamwork. Where once pilots relied on rank and habit, they now rely on openness and mutual awareness. It's a change that has saved countless lives since. For air traffic controllers, too, the story endures. Every radar trainee learns about San Diego 1978, the 2 blips that merged and disappeared. Modern radar screens now flash bright red and sound alarms when aircraft draw too close. But the human lesson remains. Never assume a pilot has the traffic. Never wait for certainty when seconds matter. Technology has evolved beyond what anyone in 1978 could imagine. Transponders talk to each other. Aircraft warn one another automatically. Controllers share linked radar data across the country. But the foundation of that safety isn't machinery, it's vigilance. In the decades that followed, former PSA employees described the airline spirit as something special. A small company with big hearts. Known for its humor and warmth, PSA was California's hometown airline, nicknamed the world's friendliest airline. The loss of Flight 182 was more than a tragedy. It was the day the airline lost its innocence. 2 years later, In 1980, PSA placed a plaque in its training center honoring the crew and passengers. When the airline was eventually absorbed by US Air in 1988, that plaque was moved and preserved. Its inscription remains simple. Their memory lives on in every flight that lands safely. For survivors and families, the years have done little to erase the image of fire falling from the sky. Many spoke of nightmares that lasted decades. Yet others found meaning in the reforms that followed, the rules rewritten, the systems improved. They often said that if the lessons of PSA 182 prevented even one future disaster, then something good had come from their loss. In 2018, on the 40th anniversary, city officials, first responders, and family members gathered at the crash site. Bells rang once for each life lost. As the final chime faded, an airliner passed high overhead, silent, steady, safe. The crowd looked up instinctively. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of engines. A sound that, thanks to the lessons of the past, millions can now trust without fear. Today, PSA 182 is remembered as one of the defining moments in aviation safety. A tragedy that reshaped how humans and machines share the sky. Every time a pilot hears a TAS warning or a controller issues a conflict alert, a trace of that morning lives on. The people aboard Flight 182 never had a chance to tell their story. But through investigation, reform, and remembrance, their story continues to speak. In every safe descent, every clear sky, and every voice that chooses to say something when silence might be easier. September 25, 1978, clear skies over San Diego. 2 aircraft, 2 crews, 1 moment of uncertainty. And from it, a truth that endures. In aviation, seeing isn't enough. You must speak. This was the story of PSA Flight 182, the tragedy that everyone saw coming, but no one stopped. In clear skies above San Diego, 2 aircraft crossed paths for only a few seconds and changed aviation forever. From that silence came progress. New systems, new awareness, and the simple rule that still protects every flight today. Never assume, always confirm. If the story moved you, help it reach others. Click subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the real events that shaped flight safety. Leave a comment below. What lesson from PSA Flight 182 stands out to you the most? Until next time, fly safe, stay curious, and remember, every safe landing begins with the lessons written in tragedies like this one.